She laughed that night at me. On the one day I tried hardest to make her feel special, she turned it into a joke I'd never forget. Her words cut deeper than any betrayal could, and I walked out, leaving behind the dinner, the ring, and everything I had planned for our anniversary. She thought it was over, and it was, just not in the way she imagined. Because when I stopped calling, when I stopped begging, when I stopped trying, she began to realize. One missed call became 10, then 20, then 255. But by then, I was long gone. And the truth? I had already won. It had been exactly 7 years to the day. 7 years since I stood at the altar, staring into her tearful eyes, thinking I had won life's greatest prize. I remember that moment with painful clarity, the tremble in her voice when she said, "I do," the way her fingers wrapped around mine like I was something sacred, irreplaceable. I believed in all of it. In her. In us. And maybe that was my first mistake. I had spent the whole week preparing for our anniversary. I wasn't the kind of man who did grand gestures every day. I worked too many hours, carried too much weight on my back. But this time I wanted her to feel it, not just hear that I loved her. I wanted her to taste it in the wine I'd chosen, feel it in the silk I had wrapped, and see it in the diamond I had tucked into the little velvet box sitting in my coat pocket. I made reservations at her favorite restaurant, the one with the candlelight that made everything look like a movie scene. I even called ahead to ask for the table by the window, the one where she once told me the world looked softer. I wore the suit she liked, navy blue, pressed to perfection. I picked her up right after work, flowers in hand, trying to hide the nervous shake in my fingers. Even after all these years, I still wanted her to see me and feel lucky. But from the moment she stepped into the car, I knew something was off. She didn't notice the flowers, didn't comment on my suit, barely looked up from her phone. She was texting someone, laughing quietly at something I wasn't part of. I told myself not to make a big deal out of it. Maybe it had been a hard day. Maybe she just needed a minute to unwind. So I drove us in silence, pretending not to notice how her body was turned ever so slightly away from mine. At dinner, things didn't improve. I tried to bring up memories, our first apartment, the honeymoon, the time we got lost in Vermont and ended up dancing in the rain outside a gas station. She smiled politely but didn't engage. Her eyes kept drifting to her phone, screen lighting up every few minutes. I should have asked. I should have demanded to know who was on the other end of those messages that seemed so much more important than the man sitting across from her. But I didn't. I still had hope. Hope that maybe the moment would come later when I gave her the gift, when she saw how much thought I had poured into every detail. So I waited. I waited through the appetizer she barely touched, through the main course she claimed was too heavy, through the dessert she waved away, saying she was full. And finally, when the waiter brought the champagne I had pre-ordered and the little plate with "Happy Anniversary" written in chocolate across it, I reached into my coat and pulled out the box. I slid it across the table. She looked at it like it was some kind of chore. "What's this?" she asked, a small smirk curling the edge of her lips. "Just open it," I said. She popped it open with one hand, still holding her phone in the other. Her eyes flicked down to the ring, then back up at me. And then she laughed. Not a laugh of joy, not a laugh of surprise. It was the kind of laugh people give when they see something pathetic and don't care enough to hide their contempt. "Are we seriously still doing this?" she said, shaking her head. "Rings and dinners and fake romance? Come on, grow up." I stared at her, my mouth slightly open, my throat dry. I thought maybe I misheard. Maybe she was joking. But there was no warmth in her eyes, no mischief. Just ice. "You don't have to keep pretending, she continued. "This marriage has been dead for a long time. I'm just waiting for you to realize it." And there it was. No warning, no discussion, no explanation. Just a knife to the heart, clean and effortless. I didn't say a word. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't beg or ask why or who. I just picked up the box, slipped the ring back inside, stood up from the table, and left. I could hear her calling after me as I walked through the restaurant. A few people turned to stare. I didn't care. For once, I didn't care about appearances or manners or making her feel comfortable. I had done all of that for too long. When I got home, I packed a small bag. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't sleep next to her that night, or maybe ever again. I turned off my phone, tossed it in the drawer, and drove. No music, no GPS, just miles of empty road and silence that was somehow louder than her voice had ever been. And that was the night everything changed. Not just because I left, but because for the first time in years, I stopped chasing a woman who never looked back. She thought she had won something by breaking me that night. But the truth was, that was the moment I began to heal. And the moment she started to lose. That night, when I drove away from the restaurant with nothing but a half-empty heart and the sound of her laughter echoing in my head, I didn't have a destination in mind, nor did I crave anything more than the distance between myself and the cold, glassy eyes of the woman I had once believed would love me forever. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I simply drove, allowing the car to carry me into the kind of silence I hadn't heard in years. A silence not filled with tension or guilt or walking on eggshells, but a clean, clear emptiness that strangely brought a sense of peace. Eventually, I ended up in a roadside motel, the kind that smells faintly of mildew and missed opportunities, where the lighting buzzed overhead and the clerk didn't bother to ask why I was checking in with tired eyes and no luggage. The room itself was forgettable. Beige walls, stained carpet, a stiff mattress that groaned with every movement, and a fan that spun in lazy, hypnotic circles above me. Yet as I lay down, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling that bore the faint shadows of old water damage, I found myself breathing easier than I had in months, maybe even years. It was in that dim-lit room, far from the table I had once thought would witness a celebration of our journey together, that I began to confront the truth I had been avoiding like a wound I never let heal. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't feel the burning urge to call her or to explain myself. Instead, what I felt was a strange kind of weightlessness, as though the burden of pretending, of trying, of hoping had finally lifted, leaving behind something far more honest than grief: clarity. For years, I had clung to the idea that relationships went through phases, that love could survive on good intentions and shared memories alone, and that temporary distance or disconnection was something we simply had to endure until the warmth returned. I told myself that she was tired, that I was distracted, that we had drifted, yes, but that the tide would eventually pull us back to one another if I just held on long enough. But as I lay there, listening to the muted sounds of traffic outside and the hum of the broken ice machine down the hall, I realized that I had mistaken endurance for devotion and silence for peace. In the morning, after a night spent with no sleep and far too many thoughts, I reached for my phone with a hesitation that was more instinct than desire. The screen lit up, revealing a single message from her. Just 3 words. No punctuation, no warmth, no explanation. "Where are you?" As though I was late for dinner, as though the night before hadn't happened, as though she hadn't shattered something inside me with her careless smirk and that condescending laugh. I didn't answer. Instead, I got dressed, gathered what little I had, and left the motel without a clear plan. I didn't return to our house. I didn't even text a friend to crash on their couch. I just drove to work, walked into the office like I always had, nodded politely at my coworkers, and buried myself in spreadsheets and to-do lists and artificial tasks that, for the first time in a long time, felt easier to navigate than my personal life. I functioned mechanically, quietly, efficiently. The next message came in the early afternoon. this time with more heat, more disbelief. Seriously? You just left? She wrote, as though I had abandoned a meal or forgotten to take out the trash, rather than walking out on a relationship that had slowly strangled the life out of me, one dismissive glance at a time. I read her words twice, maybe 3 times, then locked the screen and slid the phone face down on my desk. And then, for 2 whole days, there was nothing. No messages, no calls, no explanations, no effort to follow up on what had happened or ask why I hadn't responded. Her silence felt deliberate, weaponized, like she was waiting for me to feel guilt, to cave under the weight of routine, to return like I always had before, tail tucked between my legs and apologies spilling from my mouth like confessions to a priest. But this time I didn't move. I didn't waver. I didn't reach for my phone every 10 minutes hoping for a better message, for something soft or human. I let the silence stretch, and with each hour that passed, I felt less like the man she once controlled and more like someone I had forgotten existed. By the 4th day, the calls began. At first, just one in the morning, then another in the evening, nothing frantic, just quiet attempts to reel me in, to see if I was still within reach. I ignored them, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I had spent so long responding to her moods, her needs, her criticisms, that I had forgotten what it meant to make choices for myself without apology. Each missed call became a quiet declaration that I was no longer available, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Her text returned, this time with more urgency, more color, more manipulation. One moment she was angry. You're being ridiculous. The next, she was hurt. We need to talk. Then came the sarcasm. Fine. Go. Run away like always. And finally, desperation masquerading as concern. I'm really worried. Are you okay? But none of it moved me. None of it pierced the armor I had finally learned to wear. I didn't hate her. That would have required energy I no longer care to give. But I no longer loved her either. Not in the way that makes you fight, forgive, and rebuild. I loved a memory. A version of her that existed before the detachment, before the ridicule, before the quiet erosion of everything sacred between us. As the days turned into a week, the missed calls multiplied. 27, 53, 79. She began sending photos. Our dog curled up by the door, the kitchen where we used to cook together, the bed with only one side rumpled, along with captions that clung to a desperate nostalgia. He misses you. House feels empty. I can't sleep. But I didn't respond because I wasn't interested in the guilt trip. I wasn't interested in being lured back by familiar comforts that had long ago grown cold. I wasn't interested in being the man who made excuses for why he stayed in a place where he was mocked more than he was held. She finally broke the pattern one night, almost 2 weeks after the dinner, after the insult, after the ring that never found a finger, and sent me a message that said only, I messed up. I'm sorry. There was a time when those words would have undone me, when I would have jumped in the car, driven home, pulled her into my arms, and promised to forget everything if she just promised to stay. But that time had passed, and the man who once needed her apology, like air, no longer needed anything from her at all. Because I had found something better than revenge, better than answers, better than reconciliation. I had found silence. And in that silence, I had found peace. It happened 3 weeks after the anniversary. I remember the exact date. Not because anything particularly important was marked on the calendar, but because something inside me had shifted permanently by then, and I had begun to take notice of time again. Not as something I was losing in a loveless marriage, but as something I was finally reclaiming for myself. That morning, I had woken up not to the sound of her breathing beside me, nor the rustle of sheets in a shared bed, but to silence. And that silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. It felt like a doorway to something better. I had started going back to the gym regularly, something I hadn't done since the early days of our relationship, when everything still felt new and alive, and there was a reason to look forward to coming home. Now, each visit became more than just a workout. It was a ritual of rediscovery. With each drop of sweat, with each rep, I shed the version of myself that had twisted into a man desperate for affection that never came. I didn't recognize that desperate man anymore. I didn't want to. It was on my way home from one of those workouts that I got the message. It was a video. No words. Just 32 seconds. I hesitated before opening it. Part of me, the part that still bore faint bruises from years of emotional erosion, feared what I might see. I braced myself for another manipulation, another image meant to provoke nostalgia or guilt or both. But when I tapped the screen and the video began, what I saw was something else entirely. She was sitting on our old couch, hers now, I suppose, since I hadn't stepped foot in that house since walking out. The lighting was dim, her hair pulled back in a way that told me she hadn't expected to be seen, and her eyes were swollen, red-rimmed, tired. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept in days, a woman who had run out of excuses, of performances, of plans. She wasn't speaking in the video, just staring at the screen, breathing shallowly, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. For 32 seconds, I watched her unravel in silence. No background music, no filter, just raw, unedited vulnerability. And for the first time, I realized she was truly afraid. Not afraid of being alone. Not afraid of losing a man she had stopped appreciating long ago. But afraid because I was no longer reacting. She had always counted on my emotions, my anger, my sadness, my desperate attempts to talk things through, as proof that she still had control. My responses were her reassurance that I still cared, even if that care came at the cost of my self-worth. And now, stripped of that power, faced with a silence she could not interpret or manipulate, she was collapsing beneath the weight of her own choices. Her tears weren't for me. They were for her loss of control. They were for the realization that I no longer needed her validation to feel whole. They were for the mirror that no longer showed her someone adored and pursued, but someone abandoned by the very person she thought would always stay. When the video ended, I stared at the black screen for a long moment. Not because I didn't know what to do next, but because I was shocked by how little it moved me. Once I would have watched that clip a dozen times, searching for signs of sincerity, dissecting every blink and breath for evidence of change, for proof that the woman I had fallen in love with was still in there, somewhere buried beneath the detachment and the cruelty. But now I simply placed the phone face down on the passenger seat, turned up the music, and kept driving. Later that night, she called again. I didn't answer. I didn't even glance at the screen when it lit up. Instead, I let it ring until it stopped, then let it ring again when she tried once more. The call log filled with her name, as if the phone itself was trying to remind me that some habits die harder than others. Eventually, she left a voicemail. Her voice was quiet, controlled, almost monotone, like she was speaking through clenched teeth, trying not to reveal too much emotion in case I used it against her. She said she missed me. She said she didn't know what she had until it was gone. She said she had been confused, stressed, overwhelmed. She said she didn't mean what she said that night, that it had come out wrong, that she was hurt and trying to provoke me. She said she wanted to fix things. But buried beneath all those carefully chosen words, I heard something else. I heard fear. Not fear of losing love, but fear of losing control over the one person who had always returned, always forgave, always gave more than he received. That fear was louder than her words. And I knew, without doubt, that this wasn't a message of love. It was a negotiation attempt. A last-ditch effort to pull me back into a dynamic where she held the strings and I danced, smiling through my own dissatisfaction just to keep the peace. I deleted the voicemail without listening to the end. That night, as I sat in my rented apartment, sparse but clean, small but mine, I realized something profound. Her tears, her voice, her confessions, they didn't matter anymore. Not because I didn't care about her once, but because I finally cared more about myself. Because the love I had once given so freely had finally found its rightful place. Not in a woman who saw it as a burden, but in the man who had learned, through heartbreak and silence, to value his own peace above her approval. And in that moment, as my phone buzzed with yet another call I wouldn't answer, I understood the truth. She was grieving not the man she loved, but the control she lost. And that truth made her tears easier to watch, because they were no longer mine to wipe away. It didn't take long for the ripple effects of my silence to reach beyond her phone and into the circles we had once shared. In relationships like ours, long-term, intertwined, public, there's never just a clean break. There are friends who become casualties. There are group chats that go quiet. There are mutual connections who suddenly feel compelled to choose. And when they do, the lines are never as clear as we'd like to believe. At first, I thought maybe we could just keep it quiet. That perhaps I could slip away from the ruins of our marriage without anyone noticing the absence of weekend brunches or the canceled dinner plans or the subtle shift in social media posts. But people are perceptive, and when silence replaces routine, it doesn't go unnoticed for long. It began with a message from Alan. He and I have been friends since college, long before I met her. And over the years, our wives had grown close enough to make double dates a frequent ritual. Alan was the kind of guy who liked to keep the peace, who never raised his voice, who always looked for the middle ground, even if it meant standing on shaky principles. He texted me a simple question: "Everything okay between you two?" I stared at that message for a long time before responding. I could have lied. I could have said we were just taking space, or that work had been hectic, or that we were fine, just tired. But the truth no longer felt like something I needed to hide. So I replied with one sentence: "We're done." Alan didn't reply immediately. When he finally did, it was cautious, diplomatic as expected. "Sorry to hear that, man. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." He meant it. I could tell. But even in that message, there was a subtle hesitance, a quiet uncertainty about where to place his loyalty. And I didn't blame him. I had walked out. I had gone silent. I hadn't explained my side to anyone. As far as most of them knew, I had simply disappeared. The next message came from Marissa, one of her closest friends, a woman who had always worn a friendly face around me, but whose eyes carried judgment even when she smiled. Hers wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in faux concern. "She's been a mess lately. I don't know what happened, but she doesn't deserve to be ghosted. Whatever's going on, you could at least be an adult and talk to her." I didn't reply, not because I couldn't defend myself, but because I no longer felt obligated to plead my case to people who had already decided what version of the story they wanted to believe. It became clear, quickly, who would fall into which camp. Some friends, mostly mine, reached out quietly, privately, not to dig for gossip, but to offer quiet solidarity. They didn't ask for details. They just said they were there if I needed space or company or a distraction. They respected the fact that, for once, I wasn't trying to hold together something that had long ago shattered behind closed doors. Others, mostly hers, began the campaign of whispers. I didn't have to hear the words to know what was being said, that I had abandoned her, that I had changed, that maybe there was someone else, that maybe I was going through a midlife crisis, or that I had always been emotionally unavailable, and she had finally reached her limit. All the familiar tropes, all the assumptions that comfort people who need a simple villain to balance a complicated narrative. And she let them believe it, maybe even encouraged it. Maybe she cried in front of the right people at the right time. Maybe she told selective versions of events that painted her as confused, hurt, blindsided. Maybe she left out the part where she laughed in my face when I offered her a new ring on our anniversary after 7 years of giving her every piece of myself. Or maybe she believed her own version of things so deeply that the truth no longer mattered, even to her. It was strange watching the divide unfold. Some friends began unfollowing me online, quietly, one by one, as if digital gestures were enough to draw battle lines. Others stopped inviting me to events they had previously begged me to attend. Invitations dried up. Conversations shifted. The world shrank. But in that shrinking, I found clarity. I began to see who had truly known me and who had only ever known the version of me that existed through her lens. I began to realize how many people in our orbit were never really friends at all, just extensions of shared life that had become performative long before it ended. People who loved the couple more than the individuals. People who preferred the illusion over the uncomfortable truth. There was one moment, though, that stood out from the noise. It came from Emily, a quiet friend of ours, someone who never spoke much but always listened deeply. She sent a message late one night, long after most people had taken sides or gone silent. Her words were simple. I don't know what happened, and I don't need to, but I saw how you looked at her when she wasn't paying attention, and I saw how she looked away. That single message hit harder than anything else, because it was the truth. I had spent years pouring love into a woman who never truly let herself receive it. I had stared at her like she was everything, while she looked past me like I was background noise. And now that I was gone, her world was tilting, not because she missed me, but because she missed the attention, the certainty, the convenience of having someone who never asked her to earn the love she took for granted. I didn't need the world to validate my choices. I didn't need a courtroom of mutual friends to vote on my innocence. What I needed, what I had finally given myself, was permission to walk away from anything that made me feel small. And the moment I embraced that, the noise faded. The gossip stopped mattering. The sides stopped meaning anything. Because I hadn't walked out of marriage to prove a point. I had walked out to save the part of myself that still remembered what it felt like to be seen. And no opinion, no whisper, no judgment, no loss of shallow friendships could take that victory from me. There are moments in life when silence becomes louder than any scream, more devastating than any betrayal, and far more powerful than the sharpest words ever spoken in anger. I had learned through weeks of intentional absence that my silence was not a void, but a weapon, a mirror, and, most importantly, a liberation. And on the night I saw the number, 255, staring back at me from the glowing screen of my phone, I realized she had finally begun to hear what I had been trying to say for years without uttering a single word. It was a strange thing to hold that device in my hand and see her name, repeated again and again, etched into my call history like the grooves of a broken record. Once her name on my screen would have stirred something warm, something loyal, something painfully eager to answer. But now, as I stood beneath the pale kitchen light of the apartment I had made my own, her name felt as foreign as a number without a face, familiar only in form, no longer in meaning. I hadn't checked my phone for hours. I had spent the evening doing what had become my favorite act of quiet rebellion, living. I had taken a long walk with no destination, allowing my thoughts to unfold without the weight of another person's expectations tugging at every step. I had stopped for coffee at a place I'd never been, struck a conversation with a stranger who didn't know my name or history, and for the first time in years, I hadn't once looked at the time. When I returned home and finally glanced at my phone out of idle curiosity rather than nervous compulsion, I didn't expect to be met with that number. But there it was, 255 missed calls, all from her, all in one day. I stared at it not with amusement, not with bitterness, but with a sense of distant reverence, as if I were standing in front of a monument erected not to love, but to desperation, a desperation that had come too late to matter. I didn't scroll. I didn't open the voicemails. I didn't play her messages because I already knew what they would contain. They would be filled with the same mixture of rage and vulnerability, accusations and apologies, half-formed regrets and confused questions. They would be layered with the sound of someone unraveling not out of grief for what was lost, but out of shock that the person they took for granted had stopped reaching back. And perhaps that is what stung her most, not the ending itself, but the fact that I hadn't tried to stop it. Because for so long, I had always tried. I had always been the one to initiate the difficult conversations, to offer the olive branch, to swallow my pride in the hope of restoring something that only I seemed to miss. I had written the letters. I had bought the gifts. I had waited up late into the night, watching the front door and listening for keys that jingled later and later with each passing month. I had forgiven without being asked and stayed without being appreciated. I had endured jokes at my expense, cold stares across dinner tables, and nights when my only companion in bed was the void of her turned back. And now, having offered none of that, having said nothing, done nothing, promised nothing, I had become the one in control. But I didn't want power over her. That was never the goal. All I wanted was peace. And the only way I had found to secure it was by removing myself from the emotional roller coaster she had built and forced me to ride for years. I had exited the ride, quietly and completely, and now she was spinning alone, pulling levers and screaming into the wind, hoping I'd return to take my seat again. As I placed the phone back down on the counter, face down and muted, I walked over to the window and looked out into the stillness of the night. The city had dimmed to its quietest hour, and there was something sacred in the darkness, a kind of hush that blanketed everything in reflection. I thought back to the man I used to be, the one who would have felt guilt upon seeing her name so many times, who would have interpreted her persistence as proof of love rather than fear of being abandoned. But I was no longer that man. I had grown into someone who understood the difference between love and control, between forgiveness and surrender, between holding on and letting go. And 255 missed calls told me everything I needed to know, not about her, but about myself. Because the number didn't haunt me. It didn't hurt me. It didn't make me doubt my choice. It made me feel something rare and unfamiliar. It made me feel free. Not the kind of freedom that comes from revenge or triumph or moral superiority, but the kind of freedom that comes from knowing with absolute certainty that I would never again settle for a half-hearted version of love. The kind that made me promise myself I would never again invest years of my life into someone who only noticed my worth when my presence was removed. The kind of freedom that doesn't ask for applause or recognition, only space to breathe without fear of being diminished. And as the quiet hum of the city lulled me into stillness, I knew that whatever she said in those messages, whatever tears she shed, whatever story she spun, whatever memory she tried to resurrect, it didn't matter anymore. Because silence, once embraced, doesn't require permission. And peace, once discovered, refuses to be negotiated. It was late autumn by the time her desperation transformed into something slower, heavier, and infinitely quieter. The leaves had already begun to fall in spirals, painting the sidewalks in warm shades of gold and rust, and there was a certain stillness in the air, one that mirrored the internal stillness I had worked so long to find. By then, the calls had stopped. The barrage of text had softened. The late-night voicemails that once punctuated my silence had become infrequent and almost restrained, as though she had finally grown tired of shouting into a space that no longer echoed her voice back. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks. Not a single word. Not a line of text. Not even a passive glance at a story or a post. I had disappeared from her life in a way that was not loud or final, but deliberate and irreversible. And yet, when I saw her name appear once again on my phone that morning, nestled between unread emails and meaningless notifications, I knew, without needing to read a word, that this message would be different from the ones before it. It wasn't sent in a fit of rage, nor in the middle of the night, when loneliness screams the loudest. It arrived just after dawn, precisely when the world begins to stir and the mind becomes most vulnerable to truth. And this time, it wasn't a message at all. It was a letter, a photo of a page, handwritten, framed by the edges of the old journal I had given her years ago. The very one I bought for her during a weekend getaway, back when she still believed in reflection, in stillness, in writing things down instead of shouting them across digital platforms. The sight of that notebook, its once blank pages now filled with her looping script, stirred something within me that I hadn't expected. Not pain, not hope, but a muted ache for a time when we both still believed we were building something that mattered. Her letter began without pretense. There were no manipulative phrases, no quiescence, no bitterness masked as poetry. Just her handwriting, slightly uneven, betraying a shaking hand or an anxious mind, speaking plainly across a screen that separated us like a pane of museum glass. She wrote that she had sat with herself in silence for the first time in years. She wrote that the quiet had frightened her, not because she feared being alone, but because she feared meeting the version of herself she had spent so long avoiding. She wrote that she had looked in the mirror and finally stopped asking why left, and instead began asking what part of her had become so impossible to stay with. She confessed to moments of cruelty she had once justified as honesty, and to the way she used distance and detachment as tools of control rather than as signs of emotional protection. And then, in words I never thought I'd hear from her, she admitted that she had broken something between us long before I ever walked out. She didn't ask me to come back. She didn't beg me to forgive her. She didn't try to rewrite the past or blame circumstances or timing or stress or childhood wounds. Instead, she wrote one line that stayed with me long after the letter ended. You loved me in ways I didn't know how to receive, and now I understand that the silence wasn't your punishment, it was your peace. I read that sentence again and again, not because I was unsure of what it meant, but because it felt like the most honest thing she had ever said to me. It carried no agenda, no plea, no false promise. It simply was. And for the first time, I believed her. But belief is not the same as reconciliation. Understanding is not the same as reunion. And accountability, while beautiful and necessary, is not a key that opens doors once locked for good reason. I sat for a long time with that letter in front of me, thinking of all the things I could say in response. I could tell her I appreciated her words. I could offer the comfort of my understanding. I could even tell her that I wished her well. But none of those words seemed necessary anymore, because she hadn't written the letter for closure. She had written it because silence had finally taught her what my voice never could. That love is not something owed, nor something guaranteed by time, nor something that survives indefinitely under the weight of neglect. Love, real love, requires presence. It requires tending. And it cannot live in a place where one person is constantly shrinking to be enough. I did not reply to the letter, not out of coldness, not out of pride. but because I had already said everything I needed to say by walking away, and I knew that any words I gave her now would only serve to blur a boundary that had taken me years to build and weeks to defend in silence. Sometimes, the final plea is not a cry for return. It's a confession offered too late into the hands of someone who no longer needs it to heal. And that, I realized, was the end of our story. Not the moment she sent the letter, not the day I walked away, but the moment I read her truth and felt nothing inside me break. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel satisfaction. I simply felt still. And in that stillness, I found what I had been searching for all along. Not revenge, not vindication, just release. There was no dramatic finale, no final confrontation in the rain, no doorstep reconciliation, no tearful embrace at the train station. Our story didn't end the way people imagine stories should. It didn't explode. It didn't collapse under the weight of a final, crushing betrayal. It didn't dissolve in a moment of forgiveness that made everything make sense. It simply faded softly, surely, and completely, like the final echo in a room that no longer needs to be filled. After her letter, the silence returned, but this time it wasn't strained. It wasn't heavy or painful or filled with the sharp edge of questions left unanswered. It was natural, it was final, and it was whole. She didn't reach out again. I didn't check to see if she would. Whatever thread had tethered us together, however frayed it had already become, had finally been cut, not with a knife, but with the quiet understanding that neither of us had the right to keep holding the other hostage to old versions of ourselves. In the weeks that followed, I began to live in a way I hadn't in years, not for survival, not for routine, not for the illusion of stability, but for something simpler, something quieter, something that felt like truth. I rearranged my apartment. I got rid of things that had once belonged to us and replaced them with things that belonged only to me. I painted the walls. I let the windows stay open even on cold mornings. I bought myself a record player and listened to the old blues albums my father once played in our living room growing up. I stopped looking for reflections of her in places we'd once shared and started building places she had never touched. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't try to make her jealous. I didn't broadcast my healing for applause. Because healing, I learned, is not a performance. It's not a timeline. It's not a checklist of milestones to be announced on social media. It's the slow, deliberate act of choosing yourself every single day, even when the world tells you that you're supposed to fight to keep what hurts you. It's waking up and making coffee just for yourself. It's walking past the restaurant where you once shared your anniversaries and not feeling a thing. It's learning to sit with your own thoughts and realizing they no longer revolve around someone else's voice. Some people asked me if I missed her. Some assumed I was still hurting. Others, those who had only seen us from the outside, were surprised to learn we had even split. But I never tried to explain. I didn't owe the world an account of why I left, or how I survived, or what I had learned. Because the truest victories are often the ones that don't require witnesses. They don't need celebration. They only need to be felt quietly in the bones where no one else can touch them. And in that stillness, 1 year later, 500 steps away from the man I used to be, I finally understood what it meant to win. It wasn't about being right. It wasn't about being wanted. It wasn't even about being free. It was about reclaiming the pieces of myself I had slowly traded away in the name of love that never learned how to hold me properly. It was about no longer feeling like I had to earn basic kindness. It was about no longer walking into my home and bracing for the moment something beautiful would be belittled. It was about looking in the mirror and seeing a man who didn't flinch at his own reflection. I had one not because she was sorry, not because she missed me, not because she had come to realize the depth of what she had lost. I had one because I had stopped needing any of those things to feel whole. She will continue her life. I imagine she already has. She will rewrite the story in ways that protect her pride, maybe even tell people that I was distant, unavailable, hard to love. That's fine. That's her story to tell. But I know the truth. And more importantly, I've made peace with the fact that knowing the truth doesn't mean I need others to validate it. There's a kind of power that comes from walking away quietly. There's a kind of victory that exists in the decision not to return, even when you're invited, even when the door is left open, even when the apology is offered in just the right tone, wearing just the right face. I think, in the end, we both got what we wanted. She got silence, and I got peace. But only one of us learned to live with it. And that's why, long before the final plea, long before the last voicemail, long before the ring remained unopened and the table stood empty on our anniversary night, I had already won.